Hello and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious, unbelievable that these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. Be sure to check out the website, themysteriesofhistory.com, where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes, and of course the blog, where we will give you an extra insight into each episode, as well as all sorts of unbelievable historical content. You can also find us on social media, where you can let us know what you think of the podcast episodes, or even suggest a new historical mystery for us to investigate. And now you can even support the show. Follow the link on the website or our Instagram page and donate any amount that you may wish to help us to keep this great podcast going. Any donations are much appreciated. But don't worry, we'll keep going anyway. We love a historical mystery far too much to stop anytime soon. So now, let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. In episode 10 of our podcast, we learnt about the legacy that King Alfred the Great of Wessex left upon Anglo-Saxon England in the 9th century. After defeating Guthrum the Old, the great Danish Viking king and warlord, at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD, Alfred and Guthrum negotiated what resulted in the Treaty of Wedmore. The establishment of the Danelaw over large parts of East Anglia, the Midlands and northern England allowed the Viking settlers to live in peace and practice their cultural and legal system without fear of retribution. This negotiated peace between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings was a far cry from the days of old, where repeated Viking raids struck fear into the God-fearing and Christian communities of Anglo-Saxon England, especially on the east coast. In 792 AD, Viking raiders first attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne with such ferocity and savagery in what was a clear demonstration of power to the Anglo-Saxon people that not even the holiest of God's people would be spared their wrath. But let us turn our attention to better days, more peaceful days. In the year 954, King Alfred the Great's Danelaw has been well established for over 50 years, and it is here that change is afoot. Eric Bloodaxe, Viking King of Northumbria, has died, and Viking forces withdraw from England for over 25 years. But in the fragile geopolitical world of early Anglo-Saxon England, early medieval England, peace never lasts. We now find ourselves in the latter part of the 10th century, and there is a new king on the English throne, King Aethelred II of England, often known as Aethelred The Unready, and he ruled over one of the most tumultuous periods in English history. His reign, marked by repeated Viking invasions, political instability and controversial decisions, has long been the subject of debate among historians. Far from being a passive or incompetent monarch, Aethelred's reign reflects the immense challenges of governing a kingdom under siege once again, as well as the complex realities of leadership during the early medieval period. Let's have a look at Aethelred's background, the challenges he faced, his policies, and the legacy that's earned him his infamous nickname. Aethelred was born around 966 AD, the son of King Edgar the Peaceful and Queen Aethelred. Following the suspicious murder of his older half-brother, Edward the Martyr, in 978, Aethelred ascended to a throne at a very young age, possibly about 10 years old. This early responsibility, marred by controversy, set the tone for much of his reign. Many suspected that his mother had had a hand in Edward's death, casting a long shadow over Aethelred's legitimacy and the moral authority of his rule. Because he was so young when he first became king, much of the early rule was dominated by powerful nobles and churchmen, particularly Aethelred of Mercia and Archbishop Dunstan. This lack of centralised power and direction may have contributed to the instability that characterised Aethelred's reign right from the outset. And so what of his name? Aethelred the Unready. Unready does not imply personal unpreparedness or incompetence, as we might interpret today. It actually derives from the Old English word unread, meaning poor counsel or ill-advised. And ironically, his name Aethelred means noble counsel, so to call him unready forms a pun on the name, noble counsel, no counsel. The nickname reflects the chronicler's judgment that Aethelred was either badly advised during his reign or failed to heed on good advice, which was a serious flaw for a medieval king, dependent on the loyalty and strategic thinking of his nobles. And it was his nobles that really controlled the military. Now, as I have previously just mentioned, one of the defining features of Aethelred's reign was the resurgence of Viking invasions. In 980 AD, the Viking raiders returned to English shores and began a new onslaught on port towns. For over 25 years, England had enjoyed relative peace since the reign of his father. But now Aethelred II faced renewed Scandinavian aggression in the late 10th century, and this shattered the calm. These were not small-scale raids, but large-scale invasions by organised armies, often led by powerful Scandinavian kings, like Sven Forkbeard of Denmark. Sven, known as Forkbeard due to his long cleft beard, was the son of Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, and was born around 960 AD. It will surprise you to know that Sven was baptised a Christian because his father had converted to Christianity earlier in life. A Christian or not though, Sven was a brutal man who lived in brutal times. He was a violent warlord and warrior. His life of violence started early, in around 986 AD, and along with his allies attacked and deposed his own father, King Harald of Denmark. In early 990 AD, Sven turned his attention to England and led a campaign of fear and destruction, laying waste to large areas of the country. King Aethelred's response to the Viking threat was inconsistent and often counterproductive. In an attempt to prevent further destruction, he resorted to paying off the invaders, a policy known as the Danegeld. Massive sums of silver were given to the Vikings in the hope they would leave. The term Danegeld literally means Danish tax or payment to the Danes. It refers to the tribute money paid by Anglo-Saxon rulers to Viking invaders, especially those from Denmark, in exchange for the promise that they would not attack English towns and monasteries. The Vikings had been raiding England since the late 8th century, when the first recorded attack occurred in 793 at Lindisfarne. By the 9th century, however, Viking raids had escalated into full-scale invasions and occupations of English land. The first major use of the Danegeld as a state policy came in the 10th century, but its roots lie earlier, during the reign of King Alfred the Great, between 871 and 899 AD. Alfred resisted the Great Heathen Army through military reforms and strategic fortifications, but even he made occasional payments to the Vikings. His successors, however, increasingly relied on tribute rather than military resistance. The Danegeld was most famously used under the rule of King Aethelred II, as we know, also known as Aethelred The Unready, who reigned from 978 to 1016. During Aethelred's rule, England was plagued by renewed Viking invasions, as we've already found out. The problem for Aethelred was that these raids were larger, more frequent, and better organised than anything that came before, and they often targeted key cities, including London and Canterbury. Faced with these repeated defeats and unreliable support from the English nobility, Aethelred resorted to paying off the invaders in the hope of buying peace. The first major use of the Danegeld under Aethelred's rule came in 991 AD following the Battle of Maldon, where the English suffered a humiliating defeat. In response, Aethelred paid £10,000 of silver to Viking leaders, a vast amount at the time. And when we talk about £10,000 worth of silver, we're talking about the weight of the silver. So that's £10,000 in weight of pretty pure silver during the times. So in today's money, £10,000 worth of silver is an astronomical amount of money. We're talking millions of pounds worth. So that gives you a sense of what Aethelred was prepared to pay to keep the Vikings essentially off of his back. And this pattern continued throughout his reign. Further payments were made in 994 AD, where he paid £16,000 worth of silver to the Vikings. In 1002, he paid £24,000 worth of silver. In 1007, £36,000 worth of silver to the Viking raiders. And even in 1012, he paid £48,000 worth of silver to them. So this is an extortionate amount of money and really shows you how desperate Aethelred was becoming. And it's estimated that by 1016 the English crown had paid more than £130,000 in money in total at the time. This is in, the early 11th century, which again I say is millions and millions of pounds in today's money, an extraordinary sum of money. So the obvious question to ask is, how was Aethelred paying all this money to the Viking raiders? Where was he getting the money from? How was he raising the money? So what he did was he had special taxes that he levied on the population, on the Anglo-Saxon people, through a land tax system known as the Heergeld, or army tax. And this was collected in silver from landowners, which passed the burden down to peasants and tenants. The administrative system in place, thanks to the early development of local governance, royal shires and coinage, made it possible to raise these funds relatively efficiently. The people, the peasants, the tenants, had no say in this. If you didn't pay, you were most likely to lose your life. So, while some saw the tax as a necessary evil, better to pay the crown money than be killed by Viking raiders, others viewed it as an oppression and a sign of a weak leadership. And this policy placed enormous pressure on the English economy and no doubt contributed to the resentment amongst both the nobility and the commoners, the peasants, the peasantry, towards Aethelred. You could say, though, that in the short term, the Danegeld often did achieve its immediate objective. It bought time and reduced violence on English soil. And there were periods of relative peace following payments of the Danegeld. For example, in 994 AD, payments helped prevent further destruction by the Viking leaders Olaf Tryggvason and Sven Forkbeard, at least temporarily. However, in the long term, the Danegeld had severe consequences. It sort of gave encouragement and an incentive to the Vikings. If one Viking group is suddenly getting paid off in silver to not raid the English shore, other Viking groups are going to start thinking, well, if I just try and attack England and then ask for a Danegeld, there's a high chance I might get paid in silver. So England effectively became known as a land of easy wealth, easy pickings, which is certainly not what Aethelred would have wanted. And as we've already mentioned, there was a massive economic strain brought on by these huge sums of money, huge payments being paid to the Vikings. And the massive taxes required to fund these payments drained the treasury, drained the royal coffers, and it demanded the population basically pay for the Danegeld. And this caused political instability. The policy damaged Aethelred's reputation. Many viewed it as cowardly or unwise, undermining, effectively, his legitimacy and authority. And it contributed to the growing division between the king and his nobles. And as I said at the very beginning of this podcast, it's the nobles, really, that raise the army in times of trouble. And if you don't have the nobles on your side, especially in early medieval England, a king or a queen even is in real trouble. And, well, did the Danegeld work? Well, despite these payments, the Viking threat just kept growing stronger and stronger. Interestingly, though, the Danegeld is not a unique concept in history. Many other civilizations paid off enemies to avoid war. The Roman Empire, for example, sometimes paid barbarian tribes, often from the Germanic states, to keep them from attacking its borders. So now we understand a bit more about what the Danegeld is and how it was used. I just want to give you a specific example of where the Danegeld was used to pay off the Vikings. And I mentioned it just earlier on, where I talked about the Battle of Maldon. And the Battle of Maldon is where the Anglo-Saxons suffered a massive defeat to the Viking invaders. And the only solution here was to pay them vast amounts of silver, to bribe them not to attack the Anglo-Saxon people anymore. The Battle of Maldon was fought in 991 AD and stands as one of the most iconic events in early English history. And although it ended in defeat for the Anglo-Saxons, it became a symbol of courage, loyalty, and heroic resistance. The battle, fought between the forces of the Anglo-Saxon nobleman Brynolf and Viking invaders near Maldon in Essex, was immortalised in an Old English poem that remains one of the greatest literary achievements of its time. Through this battle and the poem that followed, the values of loyalty, duty and sacrifice were enshrined in English cultural memory for years and years to come. So as we already know, that by the end of the 10th century, England is under frequent and increasingly aggressive and precise attacks from Viking raiders, particularly from Denmark and Norway. And we've said they're no longer simple raids, they're well-coordinated military campaigns. These are campaigns of invasion and occupation, essentially. And although the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was relatively wealthy and organised, it was fragmented into various kingdoms, as we've discussed before, and it struggled to resist these threats. And the king responsible for dealing with this, as we well know, is King Aethelred The Unready. And he is lacking a strong centralised military leadership and is not helped at all by disloyal nobles that control the army effectively. So the Battle of Maldon occurs right in the middle of all of these political manoeuvrings and instability within the royal court of Aethelred. The exact location of the Battle of Maldon is believed to be near the River Blackwater in the county of Essex. So this is the southeastern side of England. and a causeway connected the mainland to a small island, which is now known as Northey Island, and this could only be crossed at low tide. So this geographic detail plays a really critical role in both the historical battle and the famous poem's dramatic setting. So according to historical sources and the poem itself, a Viking fleet, possibly led by Olaf Tryggvason, a future king of Norway, arrived and demanded tribute. In other words, demanded silver, the Danegeld effectively. So Brynolf, the Anglo-Saxon ealdorman of Essex, refused to pay, and instead he gathered his local fyrd or militia to confront the Vikings, and the two sides initially exchanged insults across the tidal causeway, and the Vikings offered to leave if they were paid a Danegeld. But Brynolf, apparently choosing honour over appeasement, replied that tribute would be paid in spear tips and sword edges. And as the tide receded, Brynolf allowed the Vikings to cross the causeway and fight on equal terms, a decision that obviously has become infamous. So this moment, often interpreted as a gesture of either arrogance or sportsmanship, if you like, gave the Vikings the advantage. And once across the tidal causeway, they engaged Brynolf's smaller force, and after fierce fighting, Brynolf himself was killed and the English lines were broken. Some of his men fled while others stood their ground and died with Brynolf. And the Vikings won a decisive victory on English soil. As I mentioned earlier, the most enduring record of the Battle of Maldon comes from the Old English poem titled The Battle of Maldon, composed and written shortly after the battle itself. And the beginning and the end of the poem, the text have actually been lost through time, but approximately 325 lines of the poem survive to this day, and they offer a really powerful and dramatic portrayal of the battle. It's a first-hand written source, and as I've discussed previously, first-hand written sources from the Anglo-Saxon period are very rare indeed, the principal source being the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. So unlike earlier heroic poetry such as Beowulf, a famous story written in Anglo-Saxon times which deals with mythological creatures and legendary kings, the poem The Battle of Maldon is rooted in a real historical event with real people, and it gives names to many of the men who fought and praises their loyalty and condemns the cowards who fled. One of the most famous passages in the poem is the speech of an old warrior named Berthwald, and delivered after Brynolf's death, and it goes as follows: "Thought shall be the harder, heart the keener, courage the greater, as our strength lessens. Here lies our leader all cut down, the valiant man in the dust. Always may he mourn, who now thinks to turn away from this war play." So this speech, this text from the poem, really exemplifies the Anglo-Saxon warrior values: loyalty to one's lord, courage in the face of death, and the shame of cowardice. It really captures the spirit of something called comitatus, which is the Germanic code of honour that bound a warrior to his leader. A really important text of great historical value. The poem really elevates the battle into a moral and cultural drama. Brynolf becomes a heroic figure who chooses honour over pragmatism. His decision to let the Vikings cross the causeway, quite possibly a tactical blunder, but it's reinterpreted in the poem as a noble, almost an act of chivalry and of fairness and courage. The poem is also one of the earliest surviving examples of patriotic English literature, and portrays a struggle not just between two armies, but between civilization and barbarism, between loyalty and betrayal. It speaks to the anxieties of a society under siege and the values it wished to uphold in the face of danger. At the same time, modern scholars have debated whether the poem is a criticism or celebration of Brynjolf's actions. His offermod, translated as pride or overconfidence, is highlighted as a possible flaw, suggesting that his noble gesture may have just been recklessness, frankly. And this really gives the poem a complex moral, feel to it, and allows readers to really sort of reflect on the cost of honour and the consequences of decisions made in the heat of battle. The immediate outcome of the Battle of Maldron was, of course, a Viking victory and another blow to Anglo-Saxon resistance. It strengthened the perception that England was vulnerable, easy pickings, and this led to larger and larger payments of Danegeld, as I previously mentioned. I hope by now I've given you an idea of the struggles that Aethelred the Unready faced during this time. He was in a desperate position. The Danegeld, payments of huge amounts of silver to the Viking hordes, were not working. And to tie in with this, the Viking raiders were also spreading and raiding and occupying large parts of Europe. And in fact, they had settled in continental Europe by this time. Normandy in northern France was established in 918 AD, and the Viking people there became known as Normans. And so, as a little interesting side point, anybody that can trace their heritage back through English history, all the way back to the Normans, can indeed trace the history further and can actually say that they are related to the Viking people. The Viking people were Normans, and of course the Normans, under the leadership of William the Bastard, invaded England in the year 1066 and defeated King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon King of England, famously at the Battle of Hastings. And the Battle of Hastings is most famously depicted as being recorded in the Bayeux Tapestry. This is a long section of tapestry that was embroidered and just depicts all these incredible images from the Battle of Hastings. An incredible piece of history to have a look at, but just bear in mind that it was made by the Normans, so there is a high chance that the images depicted may be somewhat biased. The victory of the Norman army at the Battle of Hastings, under the leadership of William the Conqueror, as he now became known, put an end to the Anglo-Saxon age, and the Normans integrated their culture into English history forever. They built castles, well-defended stone castles, built a new way of constructing buildings, brought their language, and, as I say, changed the pathway of English history forever. But the important note here is that the Norman people are descended from Vikings. But let us return to the end of the 10th century and the early 11th century, and the Normans allowed the Viking raiders to restock their vessels, resupply and rest between English raids. So this only adds to Aethelred's problems. Aethelred now finds himself in a perilous position. The Danegeld is clearly not working, and he does not have sufficient military force to repel the Vikings once and for all. So if a financial incentive isn't working, Aethelred's view is that he must turn to a political solution. And this is where we meet Emma of Normandy, a incredibly important figure in early medieval English history. Emma of Normandy was born in the year 990 AD. Her parents were Richard I of Normandy and Gunnar, a Danish Viking. The House of Normandy was in its infancy, and when in the year 1002 a political match was made for Emma to marry King Aethelred of England, this seemed to be of only mutual benefit to both royal courts. Aethelred, 20 years older than Emma, and having already fathered 10 children with his first wife, Ealgifu, this was not even considered. It was far more important that an allegiance was built between the Anglo-Saxon and Normans to calm the ongoing Viking invasions of England. And so Emma dutifully crossed the English Channel with her instructions clearly laid out before her. She was to produce English Norman children and strengthen the position of her house, as well as quelling the Viking problem in England. It's also worth bearing in mind, Emma was just 12 years old when she arrived in England. Despite her incredibly young age, Emma was well received in Aethelred's court. She was regarded as being very astute and knew her position well. She was to act as a support for Aethelred and show Anglo-Saxon England and the Viking invaders that the two parties could live together in a peaceful situation. There is no doubt of the importance of Emma of Normandy arriving in Anglo-Saxon England, as would become clear later in her life. And even with Aethelred, she did produce 3 children. Edward the Confessor was born in around 1004, who was of course to become himself a future king of England. And Alfred Etheling and Goda, her daughter, were also born during their marriage. And indeed, Emma of Normandy has the very unusual accolade of eventually in her life becoming queen consort to 2 kings of England and mother of 2 kings and stepmother to even another. But we must draw our focus back to the year 1002. Emma of Normandy has married King Aethelred, and Aethelred has high hopes for quelling the Viking invasions that are so harming his Anglo-Saxon England. But, and this is a big but, the marriage, the union between himself and Emma of Normandy did not have the effect that he so dearly wished. King Aethelred The Unready is now faced with a huge problem. He has tried a financial solution, the Danegeld. He has tried a political solution by marrying a Norman, a Viking in Emma of Normandy. But now Aethelred chooses violence. Aethelred the Unready resorts to genocide. Aethelred was determined to show the heathen forces, the Vikings, that the Anglo-Saxons were not to be messed with, and he decided to use an upcoming holy day to assert his true authority. St. Brice, or Brice of Tours, was a 5th century Frankish bishop, the 4th bishop of Tours. Tours is a city in France in the Loire Valley region. And so on November the 13th in the year 1002, St. Brice's Day, King Aethelred the Unready ordered that all Danes living in England, including settlers, traders and families, who had previously lived peacefully within English communities and the Danelaw, were to be killed. Nobody was to be spared. And how do we know this? Well, in the year 1004, King Aethelred wrote a charter and made clear his intentions for St. Brice's Day. He said as follows: "A decree was sent out by me with a council of my leading men and magnates to the effect that all the Danes who had sprung up in this island, sprouting like cockle weeds amongst the wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination." There is evidence to suggest that Aethelred's drastic action was in response to a direct threat on his own life. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he had been told that the Danes living in England would, and I quote, "faithlessly take his life and then all his counsellors, and then possess his kingdom." What we cannot know for sure, though, is that whether this plot, this rumour, was true, or simply a calculation, a fabrication by Aethelred's counsellors, designed, of course, to force him to take action and stop these massive payments of silver to the Viking armies. There is no doubt that the Anglo-Saxon nobles would have not needed much persuasion. In their eyes, there was most certainly a score to be settled. Something else we must also consider is whether or not the St. Brice's Day massacre was truly meant to target all Danes, all Scandinavian settlers to Anglo-Saxon England. Historians estimate that by the early 11th century, there are approximately 1 million Scandinavian settlers in England, and that's approximately half of the total population of Anglo-Saxon England itself. And if St. Brice's Day massacre was truly designed to be a mass execution of all Vikings, all Scandinavian settlers, surely the archaeological evidence for this would be conclusive. And it is to the archaeological evidence that we must now take a look. Firstly, it is important to mention that there has been no grave sites, no mass grave sites discovered within the regions of the Danelaw. And the Danelaw, of course, is where Viking settlers dwelt in relative peace. So this would have consisted of families and farmers. This, of course, does not mean that there aren't sites where skeletal evidence would possibly show that there is more of a spread, a range of skeletal remains that are representative of a more diverse mix of age and race. You would expect to see skeletons of females, of children, of younger people, elderly people, people essentially that would have lived within the Danelaw. And it could well be that they just simply haven't been found by random yet. But we must work with the evidence that we have. And the evidence that we have is quite compelling. In January 2008, Thames Valley Archaeological Services began excavations near St John's College in Oxford in preparation for the construction of a new accommodation building at the university site. And interestingly, they found remains of a 4,000-year-old Neolithic henge, one of the largest actually that was ever found or has been found in Britain. And they found broken pottery, food debris, and this suggested the henge had been used as a landfill site effectively during the Middle Ages, thousands of years after it was constructed. So that was really fascinating in itself. But what quickly became really clear as the archaeologists were working through the site is that they began to find human bones. And it became obvious to the archaeologists, actually, that they'd not just found a few human bones, they'd actually found a mass grave. And skeletons were seemingly piled, without any ceremony on top of each other. And after some time, the team of archaeologists worked out that they had discovered the skeletal remains of 37 people. And following radiocarbon analysis from the bones, they were able to tell that the skeletons dated from about between AD 960 to the year 1020. And this, of course, is the late Anglo-Saxon period. And we've got to be clear that mass executions during this time period weren't unheard of. So we can't link it to St. Brice's Day Massacre at this point. But the remains weren't consistent with those found at previously discovered archaeological sites that showed evidence for mass execution. And also, the skeletons were all of fighting age men and men only, ranging in ages from their late teens to their mid-30s. And they were also really tall. They were tall men. An analysis of atomic variations within their bones showed that the men's diets mainly consisted of fish and seafood. And this is very different from what the Anglo-Saxon people tended to eat, which was a more meat-based diet, meat and sort of vegetable-based diet. Now, this evidence suggested that these skeletons, these individuals, these men, were quite possibly, the remains of Vikings. And based on those facts, it appeared probable that this mass grave could be archaeological evidence demonstrating or archaeological evidence of St. Brice's Day Massacre of the year 1002. Now, what supports this theory even further is that analysis of the skeletons showed that the individuals had suffered extremely violent deaths. They had been stabbed in a very vicious manner with puncture marks in their vertebrae, their spines and ribs, and had suffered multiple blows all around their bodies from various people, from multiple attackers, if you like. One of the skeletons showed that the individual had been decapitated, had their head chopped off, and other skeletons showed, evidence of attempted decapitation. So this is building a picture of a quite horrific and violent scene. And among the 37 skeletons that died here, 27 of them had broken or fractured skulls. And this really demonstrates or indicates, in fact, that they had traumatic head injuries. So you can imagine a scene of these poor souls effectively having their heads bashed in. The archaeologists also found a really significant piece of evidence, and that showed that some of the bones had char marks, had burn marks on them. Now, this got the team pondering as to what this could mean. Now, it was discovered at some point that a letter from King Aethelred, where he described the rebuilding of St. Friedwald Church, which is now called Christ Church Cathedral, rebuilding work that occurred after the church was damaged by fire. But importantly, in this letter, King Aethelred may have given a description of why some of these skeletal remains in this mass grave showed burning, so it showed burn marks. Now, the letter goes as follows, and this is a quote from it. "Striving to escape death, the Danes entered a sanctuary of Christ, having broken by force the doors and bolts, and resolved to make a refuge and defence for themselves therein against the people of the town and the suburbs. But when all the people in pursuit strove, forced by necessity, to drive them out, and could not, they set fire to the timbers and burnt it down. Now this is a really important piece of information because it tells us two critical things. Firstly, the letter suggests that the Vikings were escaping from the people of the town and the suburbs. So they weren't necessarily escaping from trained mercenaries, Aethelred's soldiers, if you like. It could have actually been townspeople. And this would support evidence that when Aethelred gave his permission, if you like, to go and kill all Danes, it was carried out, these orders were carried out by normal people, not just soldiers, effectively. And of course, what the letter is also showing us and telling us is that when the people of the town couldn't get at the Vikings, they decided to just burn them to death anyway within the church. Of course, evidence from the skeletal remains demonstrates that not all of these Vikings were burnt within the church. Quite a significant amount essentially would have got out of the church and met their fate by, a most brutal death of having their skulls bashed in or being stabbed or even decapitated. So in summary, this archaeological site in Oxford is showing good evidence for a mass execution of Scandinavian people, men in fact, of fighting age, in the right time period. So the conclusion that is drawn is that this mass grave is demonstrating the effects of King Ethelred's orders to initiate St. Brice's Day massacre. And it's not the only site that shows good evidence for this, for there is another one. In 2009, a mass burial of archaeological human remains was discovered on the South Dorset Ridgeway during the construction of the Weymouth Relief Road. And it's often the way, actually, that any archaeological discoveries are often made by chance, and it's often when construction is underway for, well, in this case a road, but often it's housing estates or similar projects. It's by chance that we find these particular sites, and thank goodness we do, because it really adds to our knowledge of history. So Oxford Archaeology carried out study at this site of these skeletal remains, and these particular individuals were found to have lived and died around the year 1000, and indeed again originated from Scandinavia and Northern Europe. And it was analysis of the teeth of these individuals that allowed the scientists to come to the conclusion that they'd come from Scandinavia. They would have used isotopic analysis of material from their teeth, which is just incredible science. And this led to the conclusion that the approximately 52 men were indeed Vikings. Analysis of the skeletons showed that the individuals were mostly young males, with a few older men included as well. The grave in this case was more organised compared to the one in Oxford. Now this suggests that there was most likely a very different method used to kill, to execute these particular victims. Instead of what you might call a more high energy or frenzied attack, these individuals may well have been executed in a more calculated manner, because most importantly, all of the individuals had been decapitated. They had had their heads chopped off. Evidence suggests that they were decapitated by sword blows, and sword blows to the front of the neck, which was not a typical method of execution. The sword would typically come from behind under normal circumstances. And interestingly, the skeletons don't show any evidence of defensive wounds, apart from one poor soul whose hands have been sliced in half. Now that is, well, what comes to mind really is that perhaps this individual has put out their hands to defend themselves from the incoming swing of the sword, perhaps even tried to grab it, and of course the sword has gone straight through the hand and through their neck. This is all rather quite graphic, but it is building a picture of, well, what it was really like. Now what the archaeologists can also determine is that the executioner or executioners were particularly unskilled, because the archaeologist, the osteoarchaeologist, so that's an archaeologist even who studies bones, has or did find additional wounds that appear to be evidence for them being inflicted during numerous attempts even to fully decapitate the individuals. So in other words, many of the skeletons have suffered multiple blows to the head, jaw, neck and collarbones prior to successful decapitation. So you've got an unskilled executioner who is trying to chop somebody's head off and effectively missing and hitting these other parts of the body. So the osteoarchaeologist is seeing cut marks, blow marks at these particular points, which would fall in line with, yes, a very unskilled executioner indeed. Interestingly, there was also more bodies discovered at this mass grave site than there were skulls. So there are skulls missing. Now, the archaeologists have drawn the conclusion that perhaps some heads were kept as trophies or put somewhere else on display to show the local population that the Vikings can be defeated. And yes, this site in Dorset, I haven't mentioned actually, is a southern county within England. This site is good evidence again, I would say, for a site of St. Brice's Day Massacre. And it's showing that the orders of King Aethelred were not carried out in isolated locations. Dorset and Oxfordshire, are by car a couple of hours apart from each other. So these are, very different parts of the country. But of course, do two archaeological sites, two sites that seem to demonstrate evidence or show evidence for St. Brice's Day Massacre, do two sites make for a nationwide massacre, a genocide of the Viking people? Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all, really, does it? But I did mention earlier that these sites are often just discovered by pure random chance. I just said that the Dorset site, for example, was discovered when a new road was being constructed, and I would stand by that. I would say that there are probably more sites, but they just have not been found yet. We've said that this is a nationwide. It was a nationwide decree by King Aethelred, so there's no reason that there shouldn't be more of these sites in further afield, if you like, within England. We'll have to wait and see whether anything comes up or comes to light soon. Of course, there are a number of historians who believe that St. Brice's Day Massacre was not a nationwide, genocide of all Danish people, And you can't, with the current evidence, you couldn't argue with that, could you? We have two sites described here, and they are all of, or both of, fighting age men. It looks like they are both sites of Viking soldiers, potentially, not of your regular Danish settler. So yes, the evidence is suggesting that they are targeted executions rather than just a free-for-all. But who knows? As more and more evidence comes to light within the archaeological realm, the more we can add to the story. History, archaeology, science is always evolving. Nothing ever stands still. It could be a year after this podcast goes out, another couple of sites are discovered and changes the picture again. But that's what's great about history and archaeology and science in general, is that things are always changing. So finally, let's talk about whether or not King Aethelred's St. Brice's Day massacre, as we know it now, was a success. Did his actions, his massacre, stop the Viking raiders? Well, there's another part of this story, actually, that made things even worse for Aethelred, and that is the fact that he managed to involve the Danish royal family in this particular massacre, because the sister of the Danish king, who was Sven Forkbeard, who we've talked about earlier, the sister, or Sven Forkbeard's sister, was called Gunhild, and she is said to have been a hostage of Aethelred's and was allegedly killed as part of the massacre. So killing the Danish king's sister is no doubt going to make the Viking raiders even more aggravated. And of course it did. And interestingly, the remains of Gunhild were never found. So where is she? Maybe she'll come to light at some point. It'll be hard to prove that now through DNA evidence, but anything's possible. And so the death of Gunhild was clearly a significant factor in Sven Forkbeard, the Danish king's decision to invade England in 1003. And in fact, Sven Forkbeard mounted continued invasions for over a decade. So the invasions just didn't stop, essentially. And these invasions were also sustained and violent, very similar to the Vikings' invasions of over 100 years ago. In the year 1013, the Danish king Sven Forkbeard conquered England once and for all. Aethelred, his wife Emma of Normandy, and Aethelred's son had been forced into exile and fled to Normandy. In the year 1014, Sven Forkbeard finally died, and Aethelred, Emma of Normandy, and their children returned to London. However, Aethelred died soon after, and Sven Forkbeard's son, Canute, became King of England, and he made Emma of Normandy his new wife. Emma, of course, the widow of King Aethelred. King Canute would be known as Canute the Great, a significant figure in English history, and somebody who warrants their own podcast. But the important piece of information to understand here is that the Anglo-Saxon legacy did, of course, live on. Emma of Normandy marries King Canute in what was no doubt a political marriage, and would have led to the pacification of the Anglo-Saxon community, no doubt. But of course, in the year 1043, England is again ruled by an Anglo-Saxon king, as Edward the Confessor takes the crown, and he, of course, is the son of Aethelred the Unready and Emma of Normandy. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out our blog at themysteriesofhistory.com and social media outlets where we'll post extra info and images for each episode. So until next week, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.